Hey folks, hope you're doing well today. So in this chapter, we talk about photosynthesis, making the food that we all need for survival. So in this first segment, we just have some general intro information about the process of photosynthesis. So we know that ATP is critical to life, right? You have this adenosine triphosphate molecule, and what it can do is hand off one of its phosphates to some other molecule, change that molecule shape, and activate it so it goes and does something. So enzymes can be phosphorylated. They could have a phosphate group added to them, and then the enzymes become active, and then it can catalyze some reaction or any other number of things. So ATP is critical to the functioning of life, so that we can sort of keep things rolling. Now we know in chapter 9, cellular respiration is a way to make lots and lots of ATP. But cellular respiration uses carbon-based molecules as a fuel source, right? Traditionally, we think of using sugars to power the production of ATP. So in this chapter, we look at how do you make the sugars, okay? So how do we get energy from the environment and use that to make sugars that can be used to create ATP? All right, so photosynthesis, the big value in this process is that we can have photosynthetic organisms convert light energy from the sun, into sugars. So what they do ultimately is take energy from the sun and use that energy to take carbon dioxide gas out of the atmosphere and turn it into these sugars. And then, of course, the sugars then can be used for ATP production and cellular respiration. So really pretty remarkable. Now, this process of making food happens in different ways. The terms troph and auto. Auto means self, and then troph means feeding. So autotrophs are organisms that feed themselves. So probably some of the early forms of life on Earth were chemoautotrophs. Chemoautotrophs use chemicals to make their own food. So like in hydrothermal vents down deep in ocean floors, there are single-celled organisms that use like hydrogen sulfides as a fuel source to make ATP, and then that's how they live. Near the surface of the Earth, photoautotrophs dominate. Photoautotrophs use light to provide the energy to power the production of food. Okay, so we're going to focus on photoautotrophs done by plants, prokaryotes, some protists like we see the little euglena here. So lots of different types of organisms can photosynthesize. They can make their own food. And then, of course, organisms like us that are heterotrophs, we rely upon them. So this is a process we all rely upon. All right, so prokaryotes were the first photosynthetic organisms. So blue-green algae were able to evolve in such a way that they could capture carbon dioxide from the air and rip that molecule apart and then rearrange them into sugars, okay? So the remarkable thing about this is that it completely changed the planet. Early on in Earth's existence, there was virtually no molecular oxygen. There wasn't oxygen floating around the air, but there was a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide, enough that it'd be toxic to us today. But these early photosynthesizers, what they're able to do is take CO2 out of the air, go through this process of photosynthesis, which we know produces oxygen as a waste gas, and then oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere increased. So the Earth we experience today is made possible in part by these first photosynthesizers that decrease atmospheric CO2 levels and then increased atmospheric oxygen levels. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about leaf structure. So the term phyll means leaf. So we'll see phyll used frequently throughout this chapter. So looking at a leaf, on the underside of the leaf here, it looks like little mouths. These are called stomata. They're little mouths that can open and close. So these mouths, the prefix stoma means mouth. So these little mouths on the underside of leaves open and close to allow gases to pass through. It allows oxygen out of the leaf carbon dioxide into the leaf. And this illustration doesn't show it, but water also exits through this stomata. So there are three important gases to know that pass through stomata. Oxygen exits, carbon dioxide enters, and then water also exits through the stomata of leaves. Let's see. Now, looking at a cross-section of a leaf. So here we see the leaf. This is zooming in and looking at it from the side. The middle layer of the leaf is called the mesophyll. Meso means middle or center. So there are a couple of layers we see here. Here's the palisade mesophyll. Along the top, it looks like little columns. You have all these chloroplasts lined up to sort of maximize opportunity to absorb light energy. And down in here, this is called the spongy mesophyll. The spongy mesophyll has lots of pockets of air, and that is where gases can be swapped around. Okay. Now, if we look at the middle of the leaf, you see all these organelles called chloroplasts. Chloroplasts, they're the green organelles, and again, they make leaves look green. It's because it's packed. Leaves are packed with these little green organelles. And if we zoom in on a single chloroplast, you can see inside of the chloroplast are these membranes called thylakoids. Okay, so the thylakoids are the green membranes. They're sort of stacked like coins. So a stack is called a granum. That's sort of neither here nor there. But within the thylakoid, or I'm sorry, within the chloroplast is a fluid, because everything's bathed in fluid, and that fluid is called the stroma. All right, so that gives us some basic leaf anatomy. Okay, so now let's talk atoms. Let's see. So ultimately, the goal of photosynthesis is to make sugar. The generic formula for carbs is CH2O. The carb that we pay particular attention to is glucose. That's the one you see in red there. C6H12 and O6. So we know that this is the product. This is what we come up with. An interesting question is, where do you get this stuff from, right? So the carbon for glucose comes from carbon dioxide, okay? So again, you take this gas from the atmosphere, and photosynthetic organisms can rip apart the atoms and then rearrange them into this new molecule of sugar. So you can take an odorless gas and turn it into something you can, sprinkle on your cereal. Let's see. The oxygen in glucose also comes from carbon dioxide. The H comes from H2O. So we'll look at the light reactions and how you split apart water. But the hydrogen in glucose comes from water. So again, you can think about sugar, but the physical material of sugar comes from a gas in the air and then water. So it's really pretty spectacular what photosynthetic organisms can do. Now, when we rip apart water, we know the hydrogen is used to help create glucose. A fair question is, what do you do with that oxygen? All right. So now, this is you don't need to memorize any of this in terms of what atoms go where. This is just something from the book that I thought was sort of a fun way to look at how the atoms get rearranged during the metabolic process. So for photosynthesis, you think about what a plant needs. You got to give it water, you got to give it light, and it needs a carbon source. It needs CO2. And then what do plants give us? They give us glucose, they give us oxygen, and they make water as a byproduct. Okay? Again, you can see carbon dioxide can be ripped apart and used to make carbon for glucose, and then the oxygen and glucose. And then when water gets ripped apart, that hydrogen is used to make glucose. Okay, we'll pause here, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the light reactions.